Hello and welcome to this SWAYAM course titled as Aspects of Cultural Studies, and this is lecture 2, and the title of the lecture 2 is Backgrounds to the Birth of Cultural Studies. The objective of this lecture is to acquaint students with the historical and the intellectual developments that were happening in 1930s, 1950s in Britain and elsewhere, and how these historical and cultural and intellectual developments paved the way for the birth of cultural studies. The students will learn from this lecture as to how these historical or cultural or social upheavals, developments, movements are intrinsic to the birth of cultural studies. They will be able to connect or to understand the intersectionalities of cultures and cultural studies. Stuart Hall, in his 1992 essay titled Cultural Studies and its Theoretical Legacies, talks about so many conjectures, so many formations, so many backgrounds that cultural studies entail with. And to understand cultural studies, we need to actually acquaint ourselves with these different formations or different conjunctions or different developments that he is referring to. He is talking about how cultural studies was influenced by several developments during his time in 1930s and 1950s and 60s, and some of them are, as you can see on your screen, phenomenology, the great intellectual shift in the 20th century, emergence of the new world experiences and issues, the new left and cultural studies, translations, feminism, and even against cultural purity that the humanities was trying with. So, to understand cultural studies, then you need to, or one needs to, be informed of all the above backgrounds or formations or conjunctions. Obviously, in this lecture, my attempt would be to give a brief structure or brief outline of all these formations or conjunctions, and we will deal with all these formations in our later lectures that would follow this lecture. To begin with, to understand what cultural studies does, we need to go back to the school of phenomenology by Husserl, by Gadamer, by Brentano, by Heidegger, and by many others. For example, how Edmund Husserl would talk about that the reality in the world is dependent on our directedness of thoughts on the objects. So, he brings in our subjective approach or insights and its application on the object outside, and this combination of our thoughts, our feelings, our emotions, our dreams, our activities, all these experiences and their directedness onto the object is what makes the meaning of our world. So, as you can see, it is the intentionality or our subjective application in terms of our feeling, emotion, desire, actions, activities, all these constitute what is called meaning. So, this meaning therefore is rooted in culture. So, culture therefore is an extension of our subjective self, and phenomenology would oppose empiricism, intellectualism, objectivity, experimentations, all those positivist methods or tools or attributes of deriving meaning or defining knowledge. So, phenomenology would become an ontological and an epistemological shift in defining our life world or our living world. And Frankfurt School, which would come in 1923 in Germany, would adhere to some extent this understanding of the reality. And if you remember, they would critique on the prevalent industrial culture, which they called as culture industry in the society. So, their insight into the cultural reading was basically subjective, which was propounded by the phenomenologist. There are also other ways in which we can distinguish or probably understand how phenomenology would influence cultural studies, as you can see on your screen. You can see phenomenology is opposed to positivism and empiricism, and phenomenology is against scientific methods and experiences, and it considers that these methods, objectivity and experiences, rational experiences, cannot be the indispensable aspects of meaning making. In other words, to simplify, phenomenology gave the idea that it is our perception that is the method of making meaning. Perception not in the sense of, as you can see on your screen, not perception not as the product of atomic sensations, not in that Descartesian or Cartesian cognitive reality, not neurological, but perception which is modeled by culture. As you can see on a screen, culture therefore, according to phenomenologists, is shared intersubjectively and is constructed or made. This is the crux of cultural studies, the way they decode the encoded things by looking not only this structure, but the systems or the subjectivities or the cultural politics of that structure that stands on. Culture means shared conditions of repeatedly making our world and reality, and these cultural norms are human made artifices and that result from social practices. This is what phenomenology tells, and cultural studies, which would emerge 1923 in Germany and then in 1964 in England, they would be influenced by this cultural reading that they would come across with the school of phenomenologists. So, our living communication with the world is our culture of existence, and as you know, this living experience or our living world is what is called culture. So, to understand cultural studies, you need to begin with the root, and that is how phenomenology would influence the cultural cultural theorists to look at the culture rather than the mere structure or the mere rational logic or the methods of any culture. And we actually ignore these backgrounds and try to formulate a very generalized idea about cultural studies. Now, we will move to the next development that happened in the first decades and more prominently during 1950s and 1960s in the European world, which influenced the outlook into the existence or the ontology or the epistemology of knowledge. Let me tell you, this is the shift from positivist school to post-positivist school, which was much in vogue because of Thomas Kuhn, Karl Popper, Karl Mannheim, Paul Feyerabend, and many other scientists, many other scholars and sociologists who would bring in this paradigm shift in looking at the ontology and the epistemology, or looking at the knowledge, even disciplines. And this change or this intellectual shift is also the base of cultural studies. It taught them how to look at things afresh or anew or from a different perspective, rather than acknowledging or submitting to the earlier definition, that is the definitions of knowledge and disciplines by the positivist school. So, I will make a brief rundown of this positivist school, post-positivist schools, or this great intellectual shift. As you can see on your screen, you had Karl Mannheim, the Hungarian sociologist, who wrote this book called Ideology and Utopia, an introduction to the sociology of knowledge, published in 1929, when these phenomenologists were also very active. And here he mentions that, particularly talking about the sociology of knowledge, that knowledge is not objective, not rational, not in the sense very formal, as the positivist school or positivists would think about. You can think of Herbert Spencer, and you can think of Auguste Comte in sociology, even in Karl Marx, right? So, instead of believing in that formulated definite objective definition, Karl Mannheim describes that it is the sociology of knowledge, then the scientificity or objectivity of knowledge, which is the true attribute of knowledge. And it is sociology because knowledge is also modeled by the creator's ideology in terms of caste, creed, color, race, gender, and many other things. So, the terminology sociology of knowledge then comes into academic use around this time because of Karl Mannheim. And he says knowledge is how and what people frame. It is the people's stake, people's participation, people's perception, people's interpretation, and people's perception and interpretation of the world outside, which is important or which is the true attribute of knowledge. Then you had Thomas Kuhn, right, the American physicist, and he questioned the objectivity of science in his book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions in 1962. And it was a radical interrogation or interruption of the way the scientists were propagating the fixity, absoluteness, or the correctness of their paradigms, formulas, or knowledge and other things. Thomas Kuhn questions that if there is normal science, this normal science is defined and predicted by the scientific community, and it is they propound that they know what is most correct, and they are correct. So, this is a kind of paradigm here. So, what is normal science or what is positive science or what is positive knowledge is basically the prerogative of the scientists. And he goes on further to say not only this definition of normal science, but the scientist community also goes in propagating or distributing and telling people to believe that what they call normal science is true and only true. So, Kuhn's question, interrogation, interruptions against such definition of normal science also brings in the point that science too is also a social construct. So, we can have cultural reading of science also, medicines, practices, we do it, digital humanities we talk about, medical humanities we talk about. Then you have Paul Feyerabend, he goes to Austrian and he writes this book called Against Method, Outline of an Anarchist Theory of Knowledge, and he proposes for any method is correct, debunking the positivist school's emphasis on method. And as you can see on your screen, he proposes his counter-inductive method against the method, and he says we may use hypotheses that contradict well-confirmed theories and well-established experimental results. Disagreeing is something with which we can begin to prove something wrong or right. And he proposes this anarchical science based on the motto of anything goes, anything is right. Not that you have to always be right to arrive at right, you can wrong or you can err and then you can be right also. So, this democratic, liberal, open, free, creative approach is something that we can attribute to this post-positivist school. Well, there were many others, because of the brevity of time I am not going to talk about it, but nevertheless after the phenomenologist it is the great intellectual shift, the post-positivist who would also borrow the ideas from the phenomenologist and deconstruct normal science or normal knowledge or the positivist idea. Now, we move to the next very significant background to the birth of cultural studies. And I take you to my slide now. This is the birth of a different time which is called the new times, and this new times had a new agenda, and this new agenda could be fulfilled through cultural studies. Let us have a look at what is this new time was, right. So, this new times refers to the manifest breakup of traditional culture during 1950s, 1960s and 1970s in Britain and elsewhere, particularly in the European world. Manifest breakup of traditional culture. So, culture was collapsing, dismantling. So, you have multiculture, especially traditional class culture. Class system was breaking up because of industrialization, because of commercialization, because of many other changes. And the impact of the new forms of affluence. There was a new class that was rising because of the liberal economics, because of commercialization, because of industrialization, because of the political change, particularly during the post-war period. And there was a rise of consumer society, much like our society now. We are a consumer society now, and things have changed in terms of class, in terms of family, in terms of education, everything. And also there was this hierarchical or pyramidal structure of British society, like we have more structures, more stratifications, more divisions, more groups, more communities, more unions in our own time. So, all these are called, or all these constituted what is called the new times in Britain, also in other parts of the world, particularly in the European, the Western world. And there was most significantly, as we are living now, the impact of the mass media and of the emerging mass society, which the Frankfurt School takes on as their object of studies, and they come up with the idea of culture industry. Culture is something that people do not create on their own, but culture is created and imposed, hegemonized by the media. Radio, clubs, TV, television and many other things. So, this was the new times, and there was this necessity of addressing these problems, these newly emerging problems, as you can read on your screen. The next requirement for the historians, the scholars, the intellectuals was to formulate the new agenda to take on these problems, how to grapple with these newly emerging experiences. So, what was the new agenda? The new agenda was to think about the intellectual, the moral, the ethical role of the intellectuals, the scholars, historians, professors, as well as of the leaders. So, both academics and politics were supposed to address to this problem. This was the new agenda, and how there was necessity of changing the curriculum or the objective of education. Like we have NEP as a response to the changing scenario in our society, in politics, in culture, in technology, in generation also. So, the new agenda therefore was creation of a new type of civilization and a new type of culture pertaining to economics, sociology, culture, society, all kinds things or scapes, as Arjun Upadurai talks about, ethnoscapes, mediascapes, and all such scapes, all pervading all our domains of living. And it is in this context, E.P. Thompson, obviously others also would come, but I am quoting E.P. Thompson. He comes up with an idea that we need to create a society which would be socialistic, liberal, democratic, egalitarian, as Marx would also talk about. And I am quoting E.P. Thompson, as you can see on your screen. The new socialism involves the projection of a utopian ideal of a society in which labor and culture are once again made personal and significant for each individual. There should not be any state control, hegemony. People should be free to render their labor and earn money. Right? So, we talk of surplus value and other things in terms of Marx, and this kind of the new socialism was in a way different from the Marxist idea of egalitarianism, where economy would define public distribution of private properties and egalitarian society. That would be challenged by this new leftists like E.P. Thompson, Stuart Hall, Raymond Williams, Richard Hogarth, and others. And he goes on to say, in which the life of the society is shaped not by the pressures of military or state or the corporation or the bureaucrat, but of human brotherhood. So, you have more human brotherhood or humanity, where human beings are related to each other not in terms of system, but in a system, the system which is cultural, not very structural, right? And that is why Louis Althusser talks about RSA and ISA. And therefore, when we talk about these problems, we have to look at cultural, the perspective of cultural studies to tackle these problems. So, this was the 1950s, 1960s new times, a new agenda, which also paved the way for the birth of cultural studies. And this, on the other hand, gave birth to a new set of intellectuals or leftists, and they are called the new leftists. Okay. So, I will take you, I will give a pictorial depiction of these new times, so that seeing is believing, so you will believe what was happening. So, this was color TV, time of color TV, pocket transistor, beach holidaying, blah blah blah. So, you can see in terms of picture the Hungarian massacre by USSR and how they were opposing, right? And you have this dictatorship of the proletariat, Bolshevism. You had the Suez Canal crisis, how the European country was trying to control. And most significantly, this was also the time when there were hydrogen bomb testing by USSR, by England and America, and also the birth of counterculture. So, there was a set of new leftists as against the old Marxists who would rise and whose intention was chiefly intellectual task to bring social change and they emphasized on organic intellectuals, borrowing the idea from Antonio Gramsci, and this is where they emphasized that educational curriculum should be related with the outside world, which is called critical pedagogy. Classrooms should be aligned with the fields. Campus should move to the outside and outside should come to the campus. Movement from the campus to society and then from society back to the campus. And if you remember, during this time, these new times, the new leftists and the new ideology, and there would be so many movements of free speech movement and the black protests, and there would be this LGBT rights movement in America. So basically, then the new times gave birth to the new left, and the new left tried to bring in the alliance between intellectualism with labor, with common people, and that is basically the essence of cultural studies. It is not a comfortable chair in the AC room, or not that intellectuals should sit or think that they are on the top of an ivory tower, but they should combine both physical labor along with their intellectual labor to address the problems. So, this was the genesis of cultural studies. And next, obviously, I will not talk much about it because you know, Stuart Hall acknowledges how feminism also shaped the course of cultural studies. There were feminist groups also in BCCS, Birmingham Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies. As you can see, the last text, Women Take Issues, Aspects of Women's Subordination, published in 1978. So, feminism in a radical way, or rather cultural way. Later on we have cultural feminism also, as you can see, cultural feminism. So, feminism also shaped the nature and the course of cultural studies. Then obviously, you had certain classical texts, particularly that of Antonio Gramsci, and texts written by the critics in the Frankfurt School. They would be written either in German or in French, and they would be translated into English, and these theorists or critics, cultural critics at BCCS in Birmingham would read and would also shape their insights of cultural studies, as you can see. Herbert Marcuse, Adorno, Horkheimer, Hegel and others. But most significantly, you should also take note of this thing, that cultural studies also came, particularly the BCCS came as a reaction against Leibnicism or the Arnoldian concept of culture. Leibniz and Arnold and T.S. Eliot, they propounded the idea of cultural purity, both in content, style, language and form. For example, as you can see on your screen, that the essay Culture and Anarchy or the Great Tradition by F.R. Leavis, how they would talk about sweetness, beauty, aestheticism or cultural purity. So, the cultural theorists therefore, they questioned how can you maintain the purity, think of beauty from that transcendental or classical perspective or Hellenistic perspective when our life is bombarded with so many fractures, fragments, challenges, threats. How can you think of a factory worker to be sober, to be beautiful, to be gentle, or to be a beau, noble gentleman? So, there are fragmentations, politics, conflicts of culture, and instead of looking at the beauty, form, aesthetics in culture, we should rather thrust on the politics of culture, the fragments. So, concepts like cultural hybridity, all such things come into the things. So, this is how you understand the background of cultural studies. Usually, people ignore all these backgrounds like phenomenology, intellectual shift, new times, new left, also feminism, translations, they ignore. So, this is, to my knowledge, is the best form or structure of understanding cultural studies, which we tend to ignore often, and we start having a reductive idea about cultural studies. So, this was all about the basic idea about cultural studies, or the brief outline of the backgrounds of cultural studies. We will talk about all these in our subsequent chapters in detail, but for today, thank you very much.